It was a bitter cold night when the man found himself walking alone through the narrow streets of the city. The wind whipped through the alleyways as if it had a mind of its own. His coat was thick, but even that wasn't enough to shield him from the chill that seemed to sink into his bones. He had just finished his late shift at the diner, and all he wanted was to get home, crawl under the covers, and forget about the world for a few hours. The streetlights flickered ahead of him, casting long shadows across the pavement as he trudged on, his breath coming in visible clouds in the freezing air. He had always taken this road home, the one that cut through the quieter parts of the city. It was faster and less crowded. No one ever seemed to bother him here. It was just the way he liked it. The only thing that kept him company were the faint sounds of cars passing on distant streets and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. But tonight something felt off. As he neared the intersection of two empty streets, he saw the glint of flashlights up ahead and the unmistakable shapes of two police officers standing near a squad car. At first he thought little of it, assuming they were just conducting a routine check or stopping a car for something minor, but as he walked closer he could feel their eyes on him. The air around him suddenly felt heavier with each step he took. One of the officers started to move toward him, blocking his path. The others stayed by the car, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like sharp knives. "Hey you," the officer said, his voice sharp and commanding. "You're out here pretty late, aren't you?" The man stopped in his tracks and looked at the officer with a mix of confusion and weariness. "I work late at the diner," he replied, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Just heading home." "You sure about that?" The officer's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, looking him up and down as if he were inspecting a suspect. "What's in that bag?" "It's just my coat and some work stuff," the man said, shifting uncomfortably on his feet, trying to make eye contact, but the officer didn't seem satisfied. The other officer, who had been watching from the car, now stepped forward, his face unreadable behind the mask of authority. "You don't look like someone who works late, you look like someone who's up to something." The man frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You got a problem with authority or something?" the officer asked, suddenly raising his voice a little. "No, not at all," the man said, shaking his head. "I just want to go home." Without warning, the officer pointed to the cold pavement in front of him. "Drop and give me 20. The words hit the man like a slap in the face. "What are you talking about?" "You heard me," the officer said, his tone mocking. "Drop and do 20 push-ups right here, right now." The man stood frozen for a second, trying to process the request. His heart began to race. He had no idea why they were singling him out, but he could feel the tension in the air as the two officers stared at him, as if daring him to refuse. "Do it now," the officer repeated, stepping closer, as if to make sure he was heard. The man took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He wasn't sure how this would play out, but it felt wrong. Something about the situation wasn't right, but there was no way out, it seemed, and all he could do was obey. The man knelt down slowly, his hands touching the icy pavement, his mind racing. He had done push-ups before, but never in conditions like this. His palms felt the cold seeping through his jacket, and the biting wind seemed to freeze his breath in midair. The officers stood over him, watching with their arms crossed, a smugness in their eyes, as if they were enjoying every moment of his discomfort. He tried to push past the cold, but it was impossible. The moment his body lowered toward the ground, a wave of chill rushed through him like ice water. He forced himself to push back up, his arms straining as his muscles screamed in protest. The second rep was harder than the first, his breath coming in quick gasps, but he knew he couldn't stop, not if he wanted to avoid further trouble. The officers' laughter rang out behind him with each movement, their voices cruel and mocking. "Look at him go," one of them said. "Can't even do a few push-ups without shaking like a leaf." The man gritted his teeth. He couldn't let them see him falter, not even for a second. His arms felt like lead, and the cold wind cut through his clothes as if they weren't even there, but he pushed through the pain, his palms raw against the concrete, and his breath coming faster. By the time he hit the 10th push-up, his entire body felt numb, his legs trembling as he tried to keep his balance. The cold was unbearable, and each push-up seemed to take longer than the last. He could feel his fingers beginning to stiffen, his legs shaking with the effort to keep himself upright. The officers exchanged a glance and chuckled. "You know what they said," one of them sarcastically. "He's got a little fire in him, huh? Think we should make him do more." The other officer smiled cruelly. "Let's see if he can handle it. Make him do 10 more." The man's heart sank. 10 more, he thought to himself. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. The cold was gnawing at him, making every movement feel like a struggle. His arms were burning, and his body was shaking with exhaustion, but the officers weren't giving him a choice. He had to keep going or face worse. Another push-up, another jolt of pain, as his muscles screamed for rest, but he kept his face blank. The only sound in his ears was the steady rhythm of his breath and the occasional chuckle from the officers who stood by and watched. "Come on, you're not done yet," they urged, egging him on. "Do it faster." The man forced himself to move quicker, though every motion felt like he was fighting against a wall of ice. He could feel his mind starting to drift as his body began to shut down in protest, but he couldn't stop now. He had to finish, or they would keep pushing him further. When he finally reached 20, the cold seemed to have seeped deep into his bones, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. He collapsed forward briefly, his forehead touching the cold pavement as he tried to catch his breath. "All right, you're done," the first officer said coldly. "Get up." The man staggered to his feet, his head spinning with dizziness. His entire body was a frozen ache, but he didn't dare show any weakness in front of the officers who stood there watching him with their cruel smiles. He stood there in silence, his chest heaving with every breath as the officers exchanged a few more words. They didn't matter to him, not anymore. He just wanted to get away, to get home, to feel warmth again. But the words that came next would stay with him forever. "You should be grateful we didn't make you do more," they said, and with that the officers turned their backs and walked away, leaving him standing in the cold, still shaking from the ordeal. The man stood there for a long moment, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his body trembling from the cold and exhaustion. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The officers had walked away, like it was nothing, like they hadn't just humiliated him. In the middle of the street, under the harsh glare of the streetlights, his palms ached from the rough pavement, and his legs felt like jelly. The world around him seemed distant and blurry, as if he were still caught in the fog of disbelief. He wanted to scream, but he held it in his throat. It felt like his body was trying to reject what had just happened, like he was trying to wake up from a nightmare that wouldn't let go. His heart still pounded in his chest, but his mind was spinning with confusion and rage. They had done this to him for no reason. They had pushed him like an animal, and for what? His legs barely carried him as he started walking again. But every step felt heavy. The cold still clung to him like a second skin, but it wasn't the cold that bothered him anymore. It was the anger, the humiliation that burned hotter than any freezing wind could ever feel. He couldn't let this go. It wasn't just about the push-ups. It wasn't just about being forced into submission in front of those officers. It was the fact that they had taken away his dignity, and he couldn't stand it. He wasn't sure what he would do, but something inside him stirred, something fierce and sharp. He wasn't going to just walk away from this, not after what they had done to him. By the time he got home, the night had deepened the sky, a dark sheet of ink over the city. The warmth of his apartment hit him in waves as he shut the door behind him, but even the heat couldn't chase away the chill in his bones or the weight of what had happened. He peeled off his coat and dropped it to the floor, but his body still ached. His mind still raced. The image of those officers standing over him laughing still burned in his memory. He sank down onto the couch, staring at the wall, trying to steady his breath. He had made it home, but he hadn't made it out unscathed. He felt like a shell of himself, like they had taken something from him, something important, and he had no idea how to get it back. The clock ticked on the wall as the minutes stretched into hours, but he didn't move. He couldn't. It was like his body was caught between the moment of what had happened and the moment of what needed to come next. What could he do? What should he do? How could he make them understand that this wasn't okay, that he wasn't just some stranger they could push around and laugh at? His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at it distractedly, a message from a friend asking if he was okay. But he didn't feel like responding. He didn't feel like talking to anyone. He just wanted to make sense of everything he had just endured and find a way to make it right. He took a deep breath and stood up, suddenly feeling the weight of his decision. His hand trembled as he grabbed his jacket again. He knew what he had to do now. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. He would fight back, even if it meant facing the system that had tried to break him. The man walked to the window and looked out at the dark streets below. The city lights glittered like cold stars in the night sky. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let this moment fade into the past like nothing had happened. This wasn't over. The next day, the man woke up feeling heavier than he ever had before. The weight of what had happened still sat in the pit of his stomach, but now there was something else to a quiet resolve that had settled into his bones. He couldn't let yesterday fade into just another bad memory. He couldn't let those officers get away with what they had done to him, and he knew that if he didn't take action now, it would haunt him forever. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door as the early morning light began to stretch over the city. The streets were quieter than usual. Most people were still inside recovering from their own long days and nights. But the man didn't have time to waste. He had to do something to make this right, even if he didn't know exactly what it would look like yet. He didn't go straight to work. Instead, he walked through the city, stopping by the places where he knew he could find people who had seen the whole thing the night before. He didn't want to talk to anyone who didn't matter. He needed to find witnesses, people who had been there when the officer stopped him, people who could back up his story. First, he went to the small convenience store down the street where the cashier worked late into the night and often stayed in the front window watching the streets outside. "Hey man," he said, walking up to the counter, "do you remember me from last night?" The guy looked up from his phone and squinted for a second. "Yeah, I remember you," the guy said. "What happened?" The man took a deep breath and told him everything: the officers, the push-ups, the cold, the laughter, the way they had made him feel less than human. He watched the cashier's face as he listened, the concern and disbelief mixed together. "Man, that's messed up," the cashier said, shaking his head. "I didn't know that was going down. I saw the whole thing from the window. I thought they were just messing with you, but that's real bad." He paused for a second, like he was thinking, then he picked up his phone. "Hey, I got a video of them from last night. You want to see it?" The man's heart jumped in his chest. He nodded eagerly. "Yeah, let me see it." The cashier unlocked his phone and scrolled through the videos until he found the one from last night. He pressed play, and the man watched the footage of him on the ground, his arms shaking with each push-up, the officers standing over him laughing as he struggled to finish. There was no doubt about it. The video was clear as day. You could see everything: the way the officers had treated him, how they mocked him, how they pushed him to the edge with no reason at all. This is it, the man thought. This is the proof he needed. He thanked the cashier and promised to get back in touch before heading out again, his heart pounding in his chest with a new sense of purpose. He couldn't waste any time. The video was going to be key in bringing those officers down. He needed to take this further. He needed to file a report and make sure his story was heard loud and clear. The city felt different now. The streets seemed colder somehow, but the man didn't mind. He knew where he was going, and for the first time since the night before, he felt like he might actually get justice for what had been done to him. As he walked toward the police station, he felt a wave of determination wash over him. He wasn't just some victim of circumstance. He was a person with a voice, and he wasn't about to let them silence him now. The man stood outside the police station, his breath coming in visible puffs as he stared at the building before him. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his chest, but the resolve within him burned stronger than the doubt. His hand shook as he reached for the door, his mind racing with what-ifs, but he didn't let himself hesitate. He couldn't afford to. He walked into the station, the sound of his boots echoing in the quiet lobby. It was early in the morning, and the place was still empty save for a couple officers behind the desk. One of them looked up and gave him a cursory glance before returning to his paperwork. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, not looking up from his screen. The man took a deep breath and approached the desk, his heart pounding louder. Now he had to stay calm. This was the moment that would decide everything. He wasn't here to make small talk. He wasn't here to explain himself. He was here for justice. "I need to file a complaint," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. The officer finally looked up, his gaze sharpening when he saw the seriousness in the man's face. "A complaint about what exactly?" The man paused and then let the words spill out of him. "The officers from last night, they stopped me for no reason. They made me do push-ups in the freezing cold, humiliated me, laughed at me." He took another breath. "They shouldn't have done that, and I want something done about it." The officer raised an eyebrow as if sizing him up. "Are you sure you want to file this kind of complaint? We take these things seriously, but you're going to need evidence." "I have evidence," the man said, pulling out his phone and unlocking it. He handed it over, and the officer took it, cautiously scrolling through the video of the incident from the night before. The footage was undeniable. You could see the man on the ground, struggling in the freezing cold, his arms shaking with every push-up, and the officers standing above him with their mocking expressions and harsh laughter. The officer watched the video in silence, his face unreadable, but the man could see the slight tightening of his jaw and the way his eyes flicked to the screen with a hint of disbelief. "This is serious," the officer said, finally looking up from the phone, his tone different now, more measured. "I'll need to get this to internal affairs, but you should know it might take some time." "I don't care how long it takes," the man replied, his voice firm. "It needs to be dealt with. They need to face consequences for what they did." The officer nodded slowly. "We'll start an investigation, and you'll be contacted when there's an update. In the meantime, you'll need to fill out some paperwork." He slid a form across the counter. The man grabbed the pen and filled it out quickly, his hands steady now. The adrenaline from the past few hours had settled into something more solid, something like purpose. He didn't know how long it would take for anything to happen. He didn't know if the officers would be held accountable, but he knew he had done the right thing. Once the form was submitted, the officer gave him a brief nod and a small, reassuring smile. "We'll take it from here," he said. The man left the station feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. His steps were lighter now, but his mind was still sharp. The next chapter of this fight had begun, and no matter what came next, he wasn't going to back down. The days that followed felt like a blur to the man, each one stretched out endlessly as he waited for any word from the police station. The urgency of his actions had given way to the slow crawl of time that seemed to mock him with its slowness. His mind replayed the events over and over, like a broken record, the officers, their laughter, the cold, the humiliation, but every time he thought about it, something inside him grew stronger. He had done what he needed to do now. It was out of his hands, but the waiting gnawed at him. Every time his phone buzzed, he jumped, his heart leaping in his chest, only for the moment of excitement to dissolve when he saw it was just another text from a friend or a random notification. One evening, nearly a week after the incident, the man was sitting in his small apartment with a cup of coffee when the phone finally rang. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the number on the screen. It was the police station. He answered quickly, his voice tight with anticipation. "Hello. Is this the man who filed the complaint?" The officer's voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Yes, it's me," the man replied, his palms sweating despite himself. "I'm Officer Harris from Internal Affairs. I'm calling to let you know that we've started our investigation into the incident you reported." He continued, "We've reviewed the footage and spoken to the officers involved." The man's breath caught in his throat. "What happens now?" "We are proceeding with disciplinary action," the officer said after a brief pause. "We determined that the officer's behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional. They will be facing consequences. We'll also be conducting further training on handling situations like this." The man felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The words didn't quite settle in his mind. He had expected something else, maybe a slow, dragging process with no resolution, but now it was happening. Things were moving. His hands clenched at his sides as he absorbed the news. "What kind of consequences?" the man asked, his voice rough with emotion. The officer paused for a moment before answering. "We cannot share specific details about the action taken, but rest assured they will be held accountable for their behavior." "That's it," the man said, barely able to believe it. "Is this really happening?" "Yes, it is." Officer Harris said, "We understand this situation was distressing for you, and we are working to ensure something like this doesn't happen again." The man sat back in his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear as the weight of what had just been said sank in. He had done it, he had taken a stand, and now those officers would face the consequences. He wasn't sure what kind of satisfaction he expected from the moment, but there was a strange sense of peace that washed over him. "Thank you," he said quietly after a long pause. "You're welcome," the officer replied. "We'll keep you updated with any further developments." The call ended and the man sat there in silence for a while, letting the realization sink in. The waiting was over and the battle had been won. But even with the victory, there was still something in his chest that hadn't fully relaxed. Maybe it would take time to heal the scars from that night, but for now, he could finally begin to move on. He had stood up for himself, he had done what was right, and no one would take that away from him. It felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in a long time. The days that followed the phone call felt strange, like he was living in a world that had shifted just slightly from where it used to be. The man tried to go about his routine, but it wasn't the same anymore. The sense of urgency had faded, replaced by something quieter, something more reflective. He couldn't stop thinking about the officers, their faces, their cruel words, but now he also found himself thinking about something else, what had driven him to act, what had given him the strength to push back in the face of everything. He spent hours replaying the night in his head, trying to figure out why he hadn't just walked away, why he hadn't stayed silent like so many others might have done. Why had he chosen to fight back against something so small at the time, but so big in the grand scheme of things? Maybe it was because he had nothing left to lose. Maybe it was because he was tired of watching people get trampled over, tired of seeing injustice happen and doing nothing about it. Maybe it was the years of feeling small and insignificant that had finally pushed him to the breaking point and made him realize he didn't have to accept it anymore. As the days stretched into weeks, he found himself wondering about the other people who had been through something similar. Had they just given up? Had they been too afraid to speak out? Or had they never even had the chance? Maybe it was easier to just let things slide. Maybe it was easier to forget the small moments of cruelty that added up over time, but not for him, not anymore. It was strange to think that his simple decision to speak up had turned into something larger than himself, something that might actually change the way people thought about power and control, and what was acceptable and what wasn't. His mind drifted back to that day when he had walked into the police station, filled with nothing but frustration and fear, and how now he could feel that anger transforming into something else, something like purpose, a sense of pride that he had stood up when no one else would. The call had been a turning point, but it hadn't been the end. It was only the beginning. Now came the waiting, and that too would test him every day. He wondered if they would actually follow through with what they promised him. Would the officers really face consequences? Would they truly be held accountable? Or would this all fade away like so many other stories of abuse and injustice? One evening, as the man sat by his window, the same officer who had called him before called again, his voice calm and reassuring as always. "We wanted to update you on the investigation," he said. "We've moved forward with the necessary steps, and both officers involved have been placed on leave pending further review." The man's heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? "Yes," the officer continued, "we're taking this seriously and will ensure a fair process, but we do appreciate your patience in all of this." "Thank you," the man said, his voice quiet and steady. "It's just good to know that something is being done." "We'll keep you informed," the officer assured him before ending the call. The man sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't expected such a swift outcome, but it was happening. It was real, and it felt like the weight he had been carrying for so long was finally starting to lift just a little bit. But there was still more to be done. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might actually see this thing through to the end. Weeks passed, and the man found himself slipping into a new rhythm. His life no longer consumed by the constant weight of the incident, but it still lingered in the background like a shadow he couldn't shake. Every day he woke up expecting the call to come, the one that would either confirm his worst fears or bring the justice he'd been fighting for. He tried to stay focused on other things, work, his friends, the small daily routines that made up his life, but everything still seemed to circle back to that night. He had faced down the officers and taken the first steps toward making things right. One evening, as he sat on his couch scrolling through his phone, the familiar buzz of an incoming call made his heart race. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of Officer Harris. For a moment, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen. He didn't know what to expect. Was this the moment they told him it was all over, or would it be more disappointment? He answered the phone. "Hello. This is Officer Harris. We've got an update for you." The man's breath caught in his throat. He was ready, but he wasn't sure if he was prepared for whatever was about to come next. "The officers involved have been placed under investigation," the officer continued, "and after a full review of the incident, it was determined that their actions violated department policies and professional conduct guidelines. They have been reassigned to different duties and will undergo further training." The man's chest tightened. The words felt like a slow release of the tension he'd been holding for so long. He had expected some kind of closure, but hearing it felt different, more final than he had imagined. "They're being held accountable," the officer said. "We've taken the necessary steps to ensure this doesn't happen again." "Thank you," the man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It was all he could say. The rush of relief, so overwhelming, it made him dizzy. He had done it. He had taken a stand, and it had worked. "We'll continue to monitor the situation," the officer added, "and if you ever need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out." The call ended, and the man sat there in silence for a long time, letting the words sink in, his hands shaking slightly as he processed what had just happened. The officers would face consequences. They would be held accountable for their actions, and that was something he had never truly believed could happen until now. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, a quiet sense of victory settling over him. He hadn't known what to expect from this journey. He hadn't known where it would lead, but he now understood something important, that speaking up mattered, that one voice could make a difference. It wasn't just about the officers or the punishment. It was about something deeper, about the right to stand up for yourself, the right to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who you were or where you came from. He didn't know what the future held, or if he would ever fully forget the way he had been treated, but he did know this, that he had walked through fire and come out stronger on the other side. And as the days went on, he began to feel something else too, a sense of peace, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. He had done the right thing, and in the end, that was all that mattered.